Okay, so today we're diving into something that might seem kind of basic at first glance, like we all know what interpretation means, right? But when you start thinking about it like a philosopher, well, it gets really interesting really fast. Like, what does it actually mean to understand something? I mean, really?
Yeah, it's funny how we just go about our lives, interpreting words and events and facial expressions and all that. We don't often stop to actually think about how we do that, about interpretation itself. But that's where philosophical hermeneutics comes in. It's not just about what we're interpreting, it's like the whole how and why of understanding.
And for this deep dive, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on hermeneutics. It's super comprehensive. But today, we're not just going for a definition, we're going way deeper. We want to look at hermeneutics as like a fundamental part of what it means to be human, to really get into some big philosophical questions. So first things first, what is hermeneutics in this philosophical sense, for someone who's already thinking philosophically?
Well, if we're talking to philosophers, we have to be clear that hermeneutics, as a philosophical discipline, it takes interpretation as its very subject matter. It's the philosophy of interpretation. That's what makes it different from how hermeneutics is used in other areas, like theology. Like when you think about biblical hermeneutics or in law, in those fields, it's more about having a set of rules for interpreting specific texts or ideas.
Right, so it's not just some kind of toolkit for figuring out what something means. It's a whole exploration of how meaning even happens. So what kinds of philosophical questions are we talking about here?
No, it gets into some seriously deep stuff. The whole nature of understanding, what are its limits? Is it even valid? How does our ability to interpret actually shape who we are, how we see reality?
Yeah.
And then there's how language, history, art, our everyday lives, how do those all fit into this? What's really interesting here is this focus on something called interpretive experience. It's that moment, that encounter where understanding might actually happen.
So we're not talking about understanding, like getting the right answer to a math problem, right? It's not just about being correct.
No, not at all. In hermeneutics, understanding is more about having a successful interpretation, something that leads to a real insight. And this isn't judged by the standards of science. We're not looking for repeatable results or anything. And it's not about finding some ultimate bedrock truth that can't be questioned. It's a totally different kind of thing.
Which brings us to Gadamer's idea of understanding as educative or Bildung. What does that mean philosophically?
Yeah, Gadamer's onto something there. He connects this interpretive experience, the successful one, with Bildung. And as you know, Bildung is more than just learning facts, right? It's about the person being formed, their horizons expanding through engagement with culture, with history, with art. So when we really understand something like, let's say, a complex philosophical argument, it's not just adding knowledge to our heads. It's like our whole perspective can shift. How we see ourselves, how we see the world, it changes in a much deeper way.
So it's not just grasping the concepts, it's about how those concepts actually change us, change our intellectual landscape.
Exactly. Think about a philosopher reading Plato, really diving deep. They're not just learning Plato's ideas, they're actually using those ideas to refine their own thinking, to question their own assumptions, and ultimately they grow intellectually. That's building happening through this act of interpretation.
So it seems like hermeneutics is really okay with the fact that our understanding is always limited, this finitude. It's like a starting point, not a problem to be solved.
Yeah, that's one of the key things about the hermeneutical perspective. It's totally fine with the fact that we can't know everything, that our understanding is always partial, always coming from our own specific context, and always open to being revised. It's not trying to build a perfect system of knowledge based on some kind of unquestionable foundation, what philosophers call foundationalism. Instead, it's like, yeah, our understanding is incomplete, and that's okay. In fact, that's what makes it possible to keep learning and discovering new things.
So it's moving away from this like vertical way of building knowledge where you keep stacking things on top of each other and going towards something more, I don't know, dynamic, more interconnected.
Exactly. And that's where the hermeneutical circle comes in. Now, this is important for philosophers to understand. It's not some kind of vicious circle that gets you nowhere. It's more like a movement, a process of understanding. It's not like we grasp something in a straight line, step by step, starting from some ultimate truth. Instead, we're always going back and forth between our initial understanding, our first impression of the whole thing, and then the individual parts, and then back to the whole, and it keeps going like that.
So it's like when you're reading a philosophical text. You come in with certain assumptions, and those shape how you understand each argument. But then those arguments can also make you rethink your original assumptions, right?
Exactly. The classic way of explaining it is through text interpretation. Like, you understand a sentence based on the paragraph it's in, and you understand the paragraph based on the whole work. But contemporary hermeneutics takes it even further. It says that this circularity applies to everything we try to understand because it's all shaped by our existence, our history, our culture, our background, our experiences, everything we've inherited. It all forms a kind of horizon that influences how we see the world.
So understanding doesn't get deeper by finding some final answer, some ultimate truth. It gets deeper by going through this circular process of engaging with our assumptions and with what we're trying to understand. And that leads to a richer, more nuanced grasp, right?
Precisely. It's not about reaching some kind of perfect certainty. It's about understanding becoming richer and more layered through this back and forth process. Now, this whole way of thinking has a long history, and there are some really important figures who shaped how we understand hermeneutics today.
Let's talk about those figures. Starting with Schleiermacher back in the 19th century. What makes him so important for understanding hermeneutics philosophically?
Well, Friedrich Schleiermacher is really important because he moved hermeneutics beyond just interpreting religious texts. He wanted to create a universal hermeneutics, a theory of interpretation that could apply to any kind of language. For philosophers, what's really interesting is that he saw interpretation as an art. He argued that misunderstanding is actually normal, is what usually happens, and that we need a systematic approach, an art of interpretation, to bridge that gap between the person speaking or writing and the person trying to understand.
So it's an art, not a science, which means it's all about the complexity and the subtle details of meaning, right?
Right. And he focused on two main things, what he called the grammatical and the psychological aspects of discourse. The grammatical is all about the structure of the language, the rules and conventions. And the psychological is about trying to understand the author's mind, their intentions, their unique way of thinking, all of which is expressed in the text. Schleiermacher saw these two things as totally connected, and he said that real understanding means reconstructing what the author meant, maybe even understanding it better than they did themselves. He admitted this was a pretty much infinite task, which shows how hard it really is to achieve perfect understanding.
Then we have Dilthey, who brought in this whole focus on historicism. How did he build on Schleiermacher's ideas for philosophical hermeneutics?
Wilhelm Dilthey was all about how history shapes our understanding. The whole historicist movement was saying that things like human nature, reason, morality, none of that is fixed. It's all shaped by the specific historical context. Dilthey's big project was to give a solid foundation to the human sciences, things like history, literature, philosophy, and to show how they're different from the natural sciences. He didn't think we could just use the same methods for studying human experience as we do for studying nature.
So for Dilthey, it wasn't about explaining objective facts. It was about understanding lived experience in Erlebnis within its historical context, right?
Exactly. For Dilthey, understanding was the core of the human sciences, and hermeneutics was the key to doing that right. He saw it as a way to overcome skepticism about whether historical knowledge can be objective. He wanted to show that by interpreting human life as it was expressed in history, we can gain real knowledge, even if it's not the same kind of knowledge as in science.
And then there's Heidegger, who really took hermeneutics in a whole new direction. Like, it wasn't just about methodology anymore. It was about the very nature of human existence.
Yeah, Martin Heidegger's work in phenomenology was a major turning point. He didn't see hermeneutics as just a tool for studying humans. He saw it as essential for understanding what it even means to be human. For Heidegger, human existence, or Dasein, is already interpretive. We're constantly trying to make sense of ourselves and our place in the world. So hermeneutics becomes about self-interpretation.
So it's like understanding isn't just something we do. It's part of who we are. It's woven into our very being.
Exactly. Heidegger said that understanding is a possibility that's always there for us. It's part of our existence. We're always projecting ourselves into the future, thinking about possibilities, interpreting our situation, figuring out who we are in that context. That's why his approach is called hermeneutical phenomenology. It's about understanding the structure of our being by looking at our lived experience, how we actually experience things.
Wow. And this is different from Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, which was more focused on the structures of consciousness, right?
Yes, Husserl wanted to find the essential structures of consciousness through this process of reduction, but Heidegger was more interested in the concrete, specific way humans exist in the world. He talked about facticity, that we're kind of thrown into this world with certain conditions that we just can't change, and our understanding is always shaped by these pre-existing structures of our being.
So if we're always interpreting ourselves based on our own existence, It sounds like that self-interpretation could be really tricky, especially with Heidegger's idea of the they, das Man.
Oh, yeah, it definitely can be. Heidegger argued that most of the time we understand ourselves in the world through the lens of this anonymous they like. It's the way things are usually done, the opinions most people have. But this can actually hide our own real possibilities, our own authentic way of being, and it can lead us to misinterpret ourselves. He also pointed out how interpretations that have been passed down through history, they can sometimes obscure those original fundamental questions about existence.
And that's where his idea of destruction comes in, right?
Exactly. But it's important to understand that destruction isn't about destroying tradition just for the sake of it, like some kind of nihilism. It's more about critically taking apart those concepts and interpretations that we've inherited, to see what's underneath, to rediscover those original experiences and questions that might have been forgotten over time.
Then we have Gadamer, who took Heidegger's ideas and really focused on this hermeneutical experience of truth, which is different from the kind of truth we find in science.
Right. Hans-Georg Gadamer, in his book Truth and Method, he takes what Heidegger started and develops it even further, especially when it comes to understanding and truth. Gadamer says that understanding isn't just something subjective, like it's not just in our heads. He says it's a genuine experience of truth, but this truth is different from the kind of objective truth that scientists are after. He says that when we really understand something, we experience it as being true for us, as being meaningful in a way that really matters.
And he looked at things like art and the humanities to
Huh.
understand this kind of truth, right?
Exactly. Gadamer felt like the way science was dominating everything had made people forget about the kind of truth we find in art, history, and culture. He thought it was really important to look at these humanist traditions with their emphasis on Bildung, common sense, judgment, taste, and especially how we experience artworks. He saw these as prime examples of this hermeneutical experience of truth. For example, he thought experiencing art wasn't just about having some subjective aesthetic opinion, it was about participating in a kind of realization or enactment where truth can be revealed.
And he used this interesting concept of play, Spiel, to talk about how we engage with art. And what does that mean philosophically?
Yeah, Spiel is a key concept for Gadamer. He's using it to emphasize how when we experience art, we enter into this back and forth movement. We kind of lose ourselves in the activity. It's like being in a game, where you get drawn into the rules and possibilities. But this play isn't just random. It actually leads to a transformation into structure. Verwandlung ins Gebild. So what happens is our experience becomes that of a whole meaningful thing, and this reveals something about the world and ourselves.
And this experience is shaped by the fusion of horizons, right? What does that even mean?
Imagine your own perspective, everything you understand, as a kind of horizon. It's what you can see, what you can grasp. Now, when you encounter something from the past or from a different culture, they have their own horizon too. The fusion of horizons doesn't mean these horizons just blend into one, like they lose their individuality. Instead, it's like both horizons expand and become richer by meeting each other. Your horizon is broadened by encountering the other, and the horizon of the past or the other is brought into your present understanding. It's this melting together that makes both perspectives bigger and more complete.
And this whole process is always influenced by tradition and our prejudices, which are two things Gadamer really changed how we think about them.
Absolutely. Gadamer argued that our understanding always happens within a tradition, the way meaning has been passed down through history. And it's shaped by our prejudices, all our prejudgments, our preconceptions that we've inherited from this tradition. He really challenged the Enlightenment idea that prejudice is always bad and we have to get rid of it. He said that prejudice is actually necessary for understanding. It's what makes it possible in the first place because it forms that horizon we were talking about.
So tradition, for Gadamer, isn't just something holding us back from the past. It's a source of meaning and authority, even though we need to look at it critically.
Exactly. He was saying that tradition gives us a context for understanding, even if we don't realize it. And sure, we should definitely question our prejudices, but trying to completely reject tradition is impossible, and it's not even a good thing. Because if we do that, we're cutting ourselves off from a really important source of understanding. This leads to his concept of the history of effect, Wirkungsgeschichte. He's saying that how we understand something is always influenced by how it's been understood before us, by its history, and we often don't even realize it.
And language, for Gadamer, is like the main stage where all this understanding happens, right?
Absolutely. He famously said, being that can be understood is language. He saw language as more than just a way to communicate. It's the space where we actually understand the world. So hermeneutical conversation becomes this really important experience. It's not just about sharing information. It's about working together to try and express, to bring to light the meaning of what we're talking about. Truth, then, isn't so much about saying things that are factually correct. It's more about this shared process of revealing something. And Gadamer thought that this hermeneutical problem, this need for interpretation, is universal, meaning it's part of all understanding, always.
Now let's move on to Ricoeur. His hermeneutical phenomenology seems to be a little more indirect, like it's a longer path to self-understanding. And he really focuses on language, symbols, metaphors, and narratives.
Yeah, Paul Ricoeur, he builds on Heidegger's phenomenology, but he thought that getting to self-understanding wasn't so straightforward. He called it a long route because it involves interpreting all these different cultural and linguistic forms. He agreed with the idea that self-understanding is about interpreting ourselves, but he thought language was super important, and he was interested in all the different ways humans use language to express and symbolize their experience.
So that's where his interest in symbols and multiple levels of meaning comes in, right?
Exactly. Ricoeur looked at things like the symbolism of evil and other symbolic systems, showing how they can point to these deeper, hidden aspects of human experience. And he also engaged with the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is how thinkers like Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx approached interpretation, trying to uncover hidden or distorted meanings that might be lurking beneath the surface.
And later on, he got really into metaphor and narrative, right?
Yes, Ricoeur saw metaphor as more than just a fancy way of speaking. He thought it could actually create new meaning by bringing together ideas that seem totally different. And he was also really interested in how narratives, the stories we tell and hear, shape how we understand time, our own actions, and who we are. He argued that narratives have a big impact on ethics and politics because they influence how we see possibilities and how we act in the world.
Now, Gadamer's work in particular sparked a lot of debate in philosophy. Can you talk about some of the main points of contention, especially with critical theory and deconstruction?
Sure. A lot of thinkers coming from critical theory, like Jürgen Habermas, they weren't so happy with Gadamer's emphasis on tradition and the historical nature of understanding. Habermas thought that by focusing so much on tradition, Gadamer might be accidentally supporting existing power structures and ideologies that are embedded in that tradition, and that this could make it harder to be critical and to push for social change.
What did Gadamer say about that?
Well, Gadamer definitely agreed that critical thinking was important, but he said that even critique itself happens within a tradition of thought, and he thought that real interpretive experience always involves questioning your own prejudices, being critical of them. He didn't think tradition was just this one big, unchanging thing you have to accept without question. He saw it as a dynamic process that involves interpretation and reinterpretation.
What about the encounter with Derrida and deconstruction? That seems like a much bigger challenge, like questioning whether meaning can ever be stable.
Yeah, Jacques Derrida's deconstruction was a major challenge to the idea that meaning can be fixed and definite, which is something that seems to be implied in Gadamer's work. Derrida, with his ideas like difference, argued that language is inherently slippery, it's all about the play of differences and how meaning is always being postponed, deferred. This made him skeptical of whether we can ever really achieve the kind of shared understanding that Gadamer talked about with the fusion of horizons.
So Derrida basically doubted that two minds could ever truly meet in dialogue.
In essence, yes. He really highlighted the limits of language and how ambiguous it is, suggesting that meaning is always kind of running away from us. We can never fully grasp it. Gadamer and Derrida had a famous debate about this, and it's still being discussed today whether they ever really resolved their differences. But Gadamer did acknowledge in his later writings that difference plays a role and that interpretation is open-ended.
This brings us to postmodern hermeneutics, with thinkers like Lyotard and Vatimo. How did they fit into all of this?
Postmodern hermeneutics, influenced by all the critiques of grand narratives and foundationalism, takes this idea of meaning being fluid and contingent even further. Jean-Francois Lyotard talked about incredulity toward meta-narratives, which is basically being skeptical of these big, overarching frameworks that claim to explain everything.
Yeah.
Gianni Vattimo's idea of weak thought goes even further. He suggests that we should actually weaken the hold of these strong metaphysical ideas about being to allow for a more open and less dogmatic approach to interpretation. This means accepting that there are many truths and that they're all dependent on context.
And finally, the field of hermeneutics keeps developing with all these new ideas in Anglo-American philosophy, ethical and political thought, and this renewed interest in normativity, plus the emergence of hermeneutical realism.
It's true, hermeneutics is a very active area. In Anglo-American philosophy, figures like Richard Rorty explored hermeneutics as a kind of conversation that's more focused on edification than finding some objective truth. Robert Brandom and John McDowell connected hermeneutical ideas to their own work on how we reason and how our ability to reason is shaped by our cultural upbringing, by Bildung. And there's a lot of work being done on applying hermeneutics to ethical and political philosophy, looking at things like justice, community, and how interpretation plays a role in how we make decisions in our lives. And then there's this renewed interest in the question of normativity and interpretation. Like, are there better and worse ways to interpret? Which brings us back to some of those earlier figures. Finally, there's hermeneutical realism, which is trying to find a middle ground between the emphasis on interpretation and the idea that there's a real world out there that exists independently of how we interpret it. Thinkers like Maurizio Ferraris and Marcus Gabriel, who are critical of postmodernism, have really sparked this conversation. And people like Günter Figel and Christoph Koch are offering ways to reconcile the role of the interpreter with the idea that there's a reality that's not just a product of our minds.
So for philosophers, hermeneutics gives us this really powerful way to think about understanding itself. It shows us how complex it is, its limits, and how it shapes our whole relationship with the world. It's not just about understanding text, it's about this constant dynamic process of creating meaning.
Yeah.
It's part of what makes us human.
Exactly. It challenges us to move beyond this idea of knowledge as something purely objective and detached.
Mhm.
It shows us that all understanding comes from somewhere, from our history, our context, our interpretations.
Here's something for our philosophical listeners to think about. Pick a key concept in your own area of expertise, something you think you really understand. How would the hermeneutical circle apply to your understanding of it? What assumptions are shaping how you see it? What would happen if you really dug deep into the history of that concept? How it's been interpreted differently, maybe even challenged your own preconceptions? Would that lead to a richer, more nuanced understanding? We encourage you to explore the work of the thinkers we've discussed and see how these hermeneutical ideas might connect with your own philosophical journey. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.